I've talked a lot about this on my page before, but Western tropical astrology, the zodiac that we use, is really nothing more than a seasonal calendar or a seasonal tracker that tracks the sun's journey as it passes from spring to summer to fall and to autumn. And so it's very interesting to me when scientists say that, what zodiac sign you are doesn't have any influence on your behavior, because it would also suggest that what season you're born into doesn't have any influence on your behavior. And I think there are indeed scientists, though, who are still studying these seasonal differences, even studying, differences in which signs people were born under. But what I find so fascinating is this process of legitimizing or delegitimizing something, and how that ties into social and cultural understanding. It's very interesting to me that, especially within scientific research, gender differences, race differences, differences in people's sexual orientation, whether someone's gay or straight, when these differences are found in studies, when they observe these differences, people say, oh, well, of course there would be differences. But when people find differences between what zodiac sign different people were born under, the results are often dismissed as mere coincidence. And that's not necessarily to say that astrology should be considered legitimate, as these other things are, but rather to say that our culture and our society is primarily what dictates what differences we see as intrinsically meaningful and what differences we see as real, as manifesting and having implications in the real world. And science does not exist as a separate entity from the social conditions under which society operates. Science is still a part of society. And so science will reflect the power structures that our society is predicated on. And that is why you see, again, things like gender, sexual orientation, race. These differences are always affirmed. But why exactly has astrology been delegitimized as a practice, as a form of inquiry, as its own knowledge system? Why exactly has this happened? I think to understand this process of making astrology delegitimate, you need to understand, firstly, the role of science as an authority. The role of science historically, and still currently, is very often to situate Western knowledge as superior and more rational to other forms of knowledge. It has been a very racist, a very colonial, a very misogynistic, capitalistic, elitist project. And if you think otherwise, you probably have not studied the history of science. And so astrology, occupies one of those knowledge systems that exists on the periphery. And to understand this, you also have to understand the history of science and where astrology came from. Astrology did not originate in the Greco-Roman period. Astrology, all forms of astrology, go back as far as Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia is West Asia, and it also stretched down into northern Africa. And so these people within this region, within Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they had an entirely different view of science, of nature, of society. A lot of their astronomy and astrology was the same thing. There was no distinction between the two systems as we have now. Astrology and astronomy were unified in a way. And because of this, because a lot of their science, a lot of their advanced mathematics, their calculations, all of this knowledge that they had cultivated over centuries of astronomical observation, centuries of calculation. The Babylonians are the reason we have mathematics, that we have so many things. But all of this was discredited for a variety of reasons, of course. But most certainly one of the reasons was because these people were not white, and these people believed in magic. Therefore, these people were not capable of rational thought. And so that is kind of how astrology was pushed out of the history of science. Despite the fact that if we value historical accuracy, the Babylonians saw astrology and astronomy as being two sides of the same coin. They were the same. It was the same thing to them. And so the Greeks and the Romans were instead said to be the people who invented modern scientific thinking. And so, with all this being said, I don't necessarily think astrology is quote-unquote real, but I think there's a lot of other things that aren't as real as we think they are. And I also do not necessarily think it's desirable for astrology, or for other esoteric practices for that matter, to be wrapped up within the Western scientific apparatus. An apparatus, again, that is very elitist and attempts to situate its own knowledge above all other forms of knowledge.